The figure sits in a Vatican ledger dated 1523. Not a prayer, not a decree, a price list. And the buyers were not European kings. They were merchants from the archipelago the world would later call the Philippines. Here is what that ledger implies. Before colonization rewrote the story, Southeast Asian traders held enough commercial leverage to dictate terms to the most powerful religious institution in the Western world. That is the headline. Everything that follows is the evidence behind it. Let's go back to the beginning. Not 1521, when Magellan arrived. Further, much further. For centuries before any European sail appeared on the Philippine horizon, the islands were not a quiet backwater waiting to be discovered. They were a crossroads. Chinese junks came for beeswax and forest resins. Arab traders came for gold. Indian merchants came for the cotton roots that threaded through Borneo and the Sulu Sea. And the people of the archipelago, the traders from Cebu, from Mindanao, from the Visayas, from Luzon, they were not passive recipients of foreign commerce. They were the architects of it. The balangay was their instrument, a plank-built vessel, sophisticated in its joinery, capable of deep-sea navigation long before European shipbuilders solved the same problems. Philippine maritime culture was old, older than most people are comfortable admitting. So when cloves and nutmeg became the most valuable commodities on earth, gram for gram worth more than gold in certain European markets, the merchants of the archipelago were already embedded in the supply chain. They had been for generations. Stop for a moment. Think about what spices meant to medieval Europe, not flavor, power. Preserving meat through a winter could determine whether a city survived or starved. Controlling the spice route meant controlling life and death at scale. The Vatican understood this. Every European crown understood this, and the people who sat closest to the source understood it best of all. There's a catch. The Moluccas, the Spice Islands, sit just to the south of the Philippine archipelago, not across an ocean, across a manageable stretch of sea that Philippine traders had been crossing for trade, for marriage alliances, for diplomacy, for centuries. They knew those islands. They knew the growers. They knew the seasonal winds. They had relationships that no Portuguese map could replicate and no Spanish galleon could simply purchase. When Portugal established its Estado de India and began trying to monopolize the clove trade, it ran into a wall it didn't expect. The wall was not military, it was logistical. The existing trade networks of Southeast Asia were so deeply rooted, so personally maintained, so dependent on trust and kinship bonds that could not be faked or forced, that European intermediaries kept getting cut out, quietly, efficiently. Without confrontation, this is the part of the story that rarely gets told. All right, the Malay-Philippine trading world operated on a system of obligation and reciprocity that functioned like a living contract between communities. A merchant from the Visayas who arrived in a Moluccan port was not a stranger. He was a known quantity, carrying the social weight of his lineage, his datu's reputation, his community's history of fair dealing. That credibility was currency, and it was currency that Portuguese middlemen simply could not counterfeit. So the spices kept moving through channels that Rome and Lisbon could not fully see, let alone control. Now we reach the ledger. After Magellan's expedition, the one that ended with Magellan's death at the Battle of Mactan, killed by Lapu-Lapu's forces in a confrontation that itself tells you everything about how little the Europeans understood the political complexity of these islands? After that expedition limped home, the Vatican found itself in an uncomfortable position. The Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the world between Spain and Portugal, neat on paper, a catastrophe in practice. Because the Spice Islands sat in a disputed zone, and both crowns were screaming at each other across the Pope's desk. Pope Adrian VI and then Pope Clement VII after him were trying to arbitrate a commercial dispute of world historical proportions. and the commodities at the center of that dispute were moving partially through Philippine hands. There are records, fragmented, scattered across the Archivo General de Indias, across Portuguese royal correspondence, across early Dominican and Franciscan reports, that describe the frustration of European agents trying to secure direct spice contracts. The frustration has a specific texture. It is not the frustration of men fighting pirates or storms. It is the frustration of men who keep arriving at negotiations already concluded, deals already made, prices already set. By people who got there first, who always got there first. If you find that kind of hidden history compelling, the story that runs underneath the official version, you probably already know that this channel exists to surface exactly those stories. Sharing it keeps the work alive. The Datus and merchant leaders of the pre-colonial Philippines were not operating in ignorance of global economics. That's the assumption that colonization planted in the historical record, and it's an assumption worth burning down. These were people who understood exchange rates between currencies from 3 different civilizations simultaneously, who maintained credit relationships across thousands of miles of open ocean, who could read the geopolitical weather of Southeast Asia and adjust their commercial strategies accordingly. When the Spanish crown finally negotiated the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, paying Portugal 350,000 gold ducats to relinquish its claim to the Spice Islands, that number did not appear from nowhere. It reflected the actual assessed value of the spice trade, and embedded in that assessed value was the labor, the navigation, the infrastructure, and the commercial intelligence of Southeast Asian traders who had built the supply chain the Europeans were now fighting to own. There's a catch. The Philippine merchant was not a footnote in that calculation. The Philippine merchant was, in a very concrete sense, what was being calculated. Here is the What happened was far more ordinary and far more devastating. When the Spanish colonial system established itself and began writing the history of these islands, the pre-colonial world was simply reclassified as irrelevant. Not because it was small, because admitting its scale would have complicated the narrative of discovery, civilization, and salvation that justified the entire colonial project. If the people you are saving were already sophisticated international merchants, already participants in a global economy, already possessed of complex political and legal systems, then what exactly are you bringing them? Now pay attention. That question had no comfortable answer, so the question was never asked. The ledger stayed in the archive. The balangays were not mentioned in the history books. And the story started in 1521 with a Portuguese navigator arriving in waters that had been commercially navigated for 5 centuries before he was born. What we are doing now, what historians, archaeologists, and Filipino scholars have been doing with increasing urgency over the past several decades, is not romanticizing the past. It is not building a myth to replace another myth. It is reading the actual record, the physical record, the ceramic sherds and gold ornaments and boat timbers and trade weights and Arabic script documents and Chinese tributary records that collectively describe a civilization that was doing extraordinary things long before it was classified as a thing to be saved. The future of this history is not in nostalgia, it is in precision. Every excavated site, every digitized archive, every cross-referenced trade document pulls the pre-colonial Philippines into sharper focus. And the sharper that focus becomes, the more clearly you can see the shape of what was there. Now pay attention. What was there was a merchant culture of genuine global consequence. People who made the most powerful institutions in the Western world negotiate on their terms, even if those institutions never quite admitted it. People whose commercial intelligence built the supply chain that funded an age of European exploration. People whose descendants were then told that history began when the explorers arrived. Wait a second. The Pope needed the spices. The spices moved through Philippine hands. That is not a metaphor. That is the transaction record, sitting in an archive in Rome, waiting for someone to read it with clear eyes. Some records survive erasure. This one did.